It wasn't the box that surprised her. It was what wasn't supposed to be inside. Claire had deleted the proposal video 5 years ago. She remembered the trembling hand that clicked, "Yes, delete permanently." The wine glass still full. The silence after he left and never came back. But now, on a gray morning filled with sea fog and aching joints, the flash drive lay there, beneath a yellowed envelope and a bundle of dried lavender, like it had been waiting. Her hands shook as she slid it into the laptop, and then it played. Mark, kneeling, voice cracking, saying words she had trained herself to forget. That video was supposed to be gone, so why did it still exist? Why now? And most of all, what if she hadn't been the one who saved it? Claire Whitmore lived in a house that knew how to hold silence. Perched at the end of Sycamore Street in Grayhaven, a coastal town stitched together with ivy-covered fences, wind-chimed porches, and coffee shops that still played cassette tapes, her home was more memory than shelter. The wooden floors creaked with the weight of what had once been, and the kitchen window still fogged up the way it used to when Mark boiled tea and hummed whatever 90s love song the radio was replaying. That same radio now sat on the windowsill, still working, still faithful, still tuned to the station that hadn't changed its playlist in 2 decades. Claire was 47. She had once been a teacher, a sister, a fiancée, and now she was simply Claire, the woman who bought hydrangeas every Tuesday and talked to her plants more often than her neighbors. She wasn't lonely, not exactly. She just lived beside an absence too familiar to call by name. Every drawer held something he left behind. A folded note, a wine cork from their last real dinner, the spare key he never returned. Upstairs in the attic that smelled of cedar and forgotten summers was the box. Her box. Inside, a pressed flower from their first hike, the stub from a French movie neither of them understood, and a blank postcard from Venice he promised they'd write on together. It was where she kept the things that still had weight even after love had vanished. Grayhaven was the kind of town where people still waved at the mailman and remembered what time you always walked your dog. It was small enough for secrets to whisper between buildings, but kind enough to never ask too many questions. For Claire, it was both comfort and cage. And every morning, she stood on her porch, coffee in hand, watching the fog roll in from the sea like a memory too stubborn to fade. She wasn't waiting, not really. But some part of her still paused, every time the phone rang, or a knock came at the door, as if the past might walk back in wearing the same coat, smelling faintly of pine and regret. The attic smelled like old pine, mothballs, and something vaguely nostalgic, like books too long unopened or summers no one ever talked about again. Claire hadn't been up there in years. The trapdoor creaked like it was offended at being disturbed, and the narrow ladder protested under her careful steps. She'd only agreed to clean it because Lila had insisted, claiming it would help lighten the energy of the house. Claire hadn't realized her grief had weight until her niece tried to sweep it out with a feather duster. Lila was 21, stubborn and gentle, with a heart too big for the world, and playlists filled with sad songs she pretended were ironic. She was staying with Claire for a few weeks, just to breathe, after some heartbreak too fresh to explain. Claire hadn't asked questions. Pain recognizes pain like mirrors do. They sorted through boxes in silence for a while. Old linens, outdated holiday cards, Claire's childhood journals. Then, as Lila pulled down a wooden crate filled with loose photographs and dried rose petals, something small clattered to the floor. It was a USB drive, black, nondescript, slightly scratched. Claire stared at it for a beat too long. "What's this?" Lila asked, kneeling to pick it up. I don't know," Claire lied, her voice tight. But she did know. Her breath caught in her throat as she took it from Lila and turned it over in her hand. It felt too cold, too familiar. She remembered the night she thought she'd deleted that video, the trembling in her fingers, the way the screen asked, "Are you sure?" And how she clicked, "Yes," then pulled the plug before she could change her mind. And yet, here it was. Later that evening, when the house had gone quiet and the fog rolled in like a hush, Claire sat at her kitchen table with the USB resting like a confession beside her teacup. She stared at it for what felt like hours, unsure whether opening it would break her or prove she was already broken. Eventually, her fingers moved before her heart could intervene. The screen flickered. Mark appeared, exactly as he had that night, wearing the blue flannel shirt she'd bought him for their anniversary, kneeling by the fireplace, nervous, eyes wide with something too tender to name. His voice was shaking. "I don't know if I'm enough," he said, "but I want to be for you. Claire, will you?" She paused the video. Not because she couldn't watch, but because she already remembered the rest. She remembered how he looked at her, how she cried without answering, how they'd kissed like it was both a beginning and an end. And she remembered waking up 2 weeks later to an empty closet, a missing toothbrush, and no note. Her whisper was barely audible, spoken only to the quiet. "I used to believe that if someone promised forever, they would stay. Now I know. Some promises only exist so we can learn how to let go." The video left her still. Claire didn't cry, not at first. She just sat there, hands clasped tightly in her lap, like something might fall apart if she moved too quickly. Outside, the sea wind rattled the window pane, and the teacup beside her had gone cold, untouched. Mark's voice lingered in the room longer than the video did, haunting in its unfinished promise, vibrating against the stillness like a question that hadn't aged a day. She didn't replay it. She didn't need to. Every frame had already lived in her mind for 5 years, reshaped by memory, softened at the edges but never truly gone. What startled her wasn't seeing him again, but realizing how much of herself she had sealed inside that night, and how quietly she had let the world believe she was fine. The next morning, Claire didn't make coffee. She went to the bookshelf. Instead, there was a particular book, Letters to a Young Poet, she hadn't touched since he left. Mark had bought it one rainy afternoon in the small secondhand bookshop near the harbor, said he liked how the letters felt like they were written, with no intention of being answered. "Like love," he had said, smiling without looking up from the page. When she opened the book, a folded piece of paper slipped out. It wasn't yellowed with age, just slightly creased. Claire didn't remember placing it there, which meant it hadn't been her. Her heart stumbled in her chest. She unfolded the note, hands trembling not from cold, but from something quieter, deeper. Fear laced with the possibility of something she had missed. The handwriting was his. "If you find this, it means I didn't have the courage to say it out loud. I'm scared, Claire. Not of you, never of you, but of failing you. I want to marry you. I want to grow old with you. But some days, I don't know how to be enough. And I think, if I walk away first, it will hurt less for you. That's the lie I tell myself. I love you. Even if I disappear, please don't think I didn't." She read it once, then again, then a third time, her vision blurring. It wasn't closure. It wasn't even forgiveness. But it was something. Something that suggested she hadn't imagined it all. That the way he had looked at her, the way he had touched her hand just before the camera cut off, those things had been real. Love, as complicated and cowardly and quiet as it was, had existed. That day, she didn't speak to anyone. She took a walk through town instead, wrapped in her old trench coat, the one with the torn hem he used to tease her about. Grayhaven looked the same, but something inside her had shifted. Every storefront, every tree-lined path felt a shade more alive, because now they weren't just places. They were witnesses. She passed by the bookshop where they had found the Rilke book. The bell over the door still jingled the same. Ethan, the owner, looked up and smiled gently. "Haven't seen you in a while, Claire," he said, setting aside a stack of poetry anthologies. "Need anything?" She hesitated, then walked over to the counter and asked the question that had stayed curled in her chest for years. "Do you remember? The day Mark bought letters to a young poet?" Ethan blinked, then nodded slowly. "I do. He asked me if I had any blank note cards. Said he wanted to write something down while it was fresh in his head." He paused. "I offered to give him an envelope too. He said no, just the card. Said he didn't know if he'd ever send it." Claire swallowed. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. Did he say what it was for? Ethan gave her a look filled with the kind of gentleness reserved for people who'd been quietly grieving too long. "No," he said. But he looked torn, like someone trying to walk away from the one place he wanted to stay. Claire left the shop without buying anything. She carried only the note, folded carefully into her coat pocket like a fragile truth she hadn't earned but had somehow been given. The cold outside didn't bother her. What clung to her skin was the awareness that her version of the past was now slightly askew, that the man she had hated in silence might have been broken, not cruel. Back home, the house felt warmer, though she hadn't touched the thermostat. The kind of warmth that comes from a shift in gravity, when something buried begins to unearth itself. She sat in her reading chair, the note still in her palm, and for the first time in years, she let her body lean back, spine relaxed, as if trusting the space to hold her. That night, she opened the USB again, not to watch the video, but to see what else was on it. She hadn't thought to look before. It had always been the video. The only one that mattered. But now, a second file blinked back at her, untitled. Time-stamped just 2 days after the proposal. Curiosity mingled with dread. She clicked. The camera showed their living room, empty. Then, Mark entered the frame. He didn't kneel this time. He didn't even speak to the camera at first. He paced, rubbed the back of his neck, then looked straight ahead. "Claire, I'm recording this because I'm not sure I'll be able to say it to your face. I don't know how to ask for more time without sounding like I'm walking away. I'm not. Something's wrong. I've been feeling off. I went to see a doctor. They want to run tests. I haven't told you because I didn't want to make you worry. But I think I should have. Because now it's eating at me. And if I mess this up, if I vanish or act distant, I need you to know. It was never because I didn't want you. I just didn't want to bring you into the fog with me." The screen faded to black. Claire's hands were over her mouth. She didn't weep, not exactly. But something inside her cracked, the part that had held the question, "How could you leave me like that?" for so long, like a stone behind her ribs. Now that question had an answer. And even if the answer came too late to undo the hurt, it came just in time to shift the way she remembered. He never expected the truth would begin with that second video. In the days that followed, Claire moved as if caught in the middle of two versions of her life. The one she had accepted and grown around like a tree bending in wind, and the one that now hovered just behind her shoulder, whispering a different story. The note, the second video, the sound of Mark's voice laced with hesitation and tenderness. They had opened something that had long been sealed. Not a wound, exactly, but a room she had closed without realizing she still held the key. Mornings came with soft fog and the scent of the sea drifting in through cracked windows. Claire's routine remained the same. Tea at dawn, walks to the local grocer, folding laundry while the radio played. But now, everything felt as if it had an echo. Even silence was no longer empty. It throbbed with meaning, like a paused song. She could finally hear again. One Thursday afternoon, She found herself wandering the aisles of the library where she once volunteered on weekends. The place still smelled like paper and lemon polish. She ran her fingers across familiar spines, Austen, Bronte, Eliot, and stopped at a shelf near the corner reading nook. There, tucked between two worn poetry collections, was a slim, handwritten journal. It wasn't cataloged, and its leather cover looked too personal to belong to the library. Curiosity edged out hesitation. She flipped it open and found the first page marked, "To the woman I couldn't say this to." The handwriting wasn't Mark's, but it held the same softness. The entries weren't dated, just filled with words that seemed suspended in time. Letters never sent, truths never spoken aloud. She sat down on the bench and read until her eyes blurred. When she looked up, the sun had moved, casting golden strips through the dusty blinds. As she closed the journal, she realized something. We are not alone in the ache of things unsaid. This pain, of holding on, of letting go too late, of loving someone silently, is everywhere, etched into the quiet corners of ordinary lives. That night, back home, she pulled out her old letters from Mark. Not the romantic ones, but the everyday. Notes. Pick up apples, don't forget your scarf. Left dinner in the oven. She read them aloud, like reciting a liturgy of a life that almost was. The next morning, Claire stepped out early, wrapped in the old gray coat she hadn't worn in years, the one Mark used to throw over her shoulders whenever she forgot her own. The pockets still held a broken pencil and a train ticket to Portland, from a weekend they never took. Her fingers grazed them like familiar ghosts. She walked without a clear destination until she found herself in front of Second Chapter, the town's only bookstore. The bell above the door gave its usual soft jingle, and the scent of paper and dust wrapped around her like something maternal. Ethan looked up from behind the counter and raised a brow, not in surprise, but in quiet welcome. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how good the books smell," he said. Claire gave him a tired smile. "I remembered." He slid a small stack across the counter, new arrivals in the local memoir section. One title caught her eye, "The Art of Losing Gently." She picked it up, traced the embossed letters, and said softly, "Do you believe people come back in pieces?" Ethan tilted his head. "I think sometimes they never fully leave. The good ones, anyway." Claire didn't answer, but something in her chest loosened, like a knot given permission to dissolve. She wandered the aisles, letting her fingers skim book spines as if trying to remember something important. Then, tucked behind a row of anthologies, she saw it. Thin volume of collected love letters, half hidden, as if someone didn't want it found but couldn't bear to throw it away. Inside, one letter had been underlined. "I loved you in silence because the sound of it might have broken everything." Claire stared at it for a long time, her heart quietly rearranging itself. That evening, she found Lila sketching on the porch. The wind had picked up, and strands of her niece's hair whipped across her face like seagrass. "I've been thinking," Claire said, sitting beside her, "about the parts of people we never really see, the fears they carry like shadows." Lila nodded, shading in the edge of a half-finished face. "Sometimes we're just too young to understand them, or too scared to ask." Claire looked out at the street, empty but alive with memory. Mark wasn't cruel, just lost. And I think maybe I was too. "Do you still love him?" Claire's smile was small but steady. "I don't think love ever vanishes. It just learns how to live somewhere quieter." A few days later, Claire opened a drawer she hadn't touched since the week after Mark left. It was the drawer under the bookshelf, the one with old birthday cards, spare keys, and things too small to grieve, but too meaningful to throw away. Beneath a packet of tea that had long since expired and a faded scarf that still smelled faintly of lavender, she found a notebook. Hers. Not a journal. but a spiral-bound sketchbook from years ago when she'd tried to paint again. Before teaching consumed her. Before grief quieted her hands. Flipping through it, she found only half-finished watercolors, a cup of tea, a pair of hands, an open window. And on one page, there was a sketch of Mark from memory. Soft pencil lines capturing the exact tilt of his jaw, the way his shoulders slouched slightly when he was tired, and those eyes that always looked like they were about to ask something important, but never did. Lila peeked in through the doorway. "You draw?" "I used to," Claire said, brushing her hand gently over the paper. "But then I started only drawing what I missed. And that became too much." Lila came to sit beside her, cross-legged on the floor like a child again. "You know, sometimes I think we don't let go of people. We just carry them better." Claire looked at her niece and saw a reflection of her younger self. The girl who still believed that heartbreak was something dramatic and fast. But real heartbreak, she'd come to understand, was slow, almost quiet. A long unpeeling of someone from the corners of your life. She closed the sketchbook and placed it on the table with a kind of finality. Not to hide it, but to acknowledge it. That evening, Claire cooked the pasta dish Mark used to love, linguine, with lemon and garlic, the one he'd request every Sunday. She hadn't made it since he left. The kitchen smelled like 5 years ago. Rosemary, soft butter, red wine she rarely opened. She poured 2 glasses. One stayed full. After dinner, she sat at the table alone and wrote a letter. Not to Mark, but to herself. You survived. You stayed. You forgave someone who never apologized. You let the world keep spinning even when yours stopped. And you still, somehow, believe in love. That's enough. Then she folded the paper and placed it in the same envelope where Mark's note had been. A conversation, at last, though one-sided and belated. But somehow, that felt right. Not every dialogue needs a reply. The next morning, she stood by the ocean with Ruth and Lila. It had become a quiet ritual. Saturday morning walks down to the edge of the pier. Lila carried her camera, Ruth brought seed for the gulls, and Claire brought her silence, which wasn't emptiness anymore, but reverence. They watched the waves roll in like questions that no longer needed answers. Claire reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the flash drive. She'd been carrying it for weeks. Without a word, she walked to the very end of the pier, knelt, and let it drop into the water. No drama, no music swell, just the sound of something small falling back into stillness. Lila squeezed her hand. Ruth simply nodded as if to say, "Yes, that's how you end a chapter." And Claire smiled, not because she had moved on, but because she had finally moved through. A week later, Claire found herself rearranging her bookshelves, not out of necessity, but from a quiet desire to make space. Space not just in the physical sense, but in that deeper, unnameable way where new things might grow. She removed old textbooks from her teaching years, donated unused novels, and then reached the lowest shelf where she kept the things she didn't know how to categorize. There, wrapped in a scarf she hadn't worn since her 39th birthday, was a tiny wooden music box. Mark had given it to her before they were engaged, on a rainy April morning when they'd missed their train and spent hours waiting in a small-town cafe that smelled of cinnamon and dust. She hadn't remembered the gift until now. As she wound the key, the melody began, a few delicate, uncertain notes from Claire de Lune, slightly off-pitch but still beautiful. She held the box to her chest and closed her eyes. It wasn't the gift itself she remembered. It was the way Mark had handed it to her, without occasion, without reason, just because she had mentioned once in passing that her mother used to play that piece when she couldn't sleep. Love, she realized, had always lived in those in-between moments. That evening, when Lila returned from town with coffee and fresh pears, she found Claire seated at the dining table with the music box open, a notebook beside her. "I'm writing him a story," Claire said, looking up. Not a letter this time. A story. One where he stays. Lila blinked, then set down the bags. What happens in the end? I don't know yet, Claire replied. Maybe nothing. Maybe that's the point. They ate dinner with the windows open, listening to the rain tap gently against the glass. Lila talked about wanting to move to Portland, about trying to start over. Claire listened, nodded, and for the first time in years, felt like someone whose presence offered something other than grief. You know, Lila said softly as they cleared the plates. I used to think you were the saddest person I knew. But you're not, Claire laughed, a low, warm sound she hadn't heard from herself in far too long. What changed your mind? You started looking forward. That night, after Lila had gone to bed, Claire walked out into the garden behind the house. The hydrangeas were starting to bloom again, those stubborn, aching blues that always reminded her of late summer and beginnings that didn't quite. No, they were endings. She carried with her a small stack of old letters, not from Mark, but from her parents. Letters written decades ago found in a box when she first moved back to Grayhaven. Some were silly, some mundane, but most were full of love in its most ordinary, durable form. She sat on the bench and began to read them by the soft light from the kitchen window. In the stillness of the yard, she finally understood. Not all love stories are between lovers. Some are between selves, past and present, wounded and healing, the girl who waited and the woman who endured. As she read, she thought about the life she had almost built with Mark. The trips they planned but never took, the dog they talked about adopting, the guest room they never painted. She had kept those plans tucked away like unopened gifts, afraid to discard them, too guilty to unwrap them without him. But now she saw them differently. They weren't lost. They were unchosen, and she still had time to choose again. The following Sunday, Claire joined Ruth at the Community Art Center. For years, Ruth had been trying to convince her to teach a watercolor class. Just for beginners, she always said. Just once a month. Claire had always declined, offering vague excuses. But this time, she said yes. They stood together. In the studio, the scent of paint and turpentine heavy in the air, the walls lined with empty canvases. Think you'll remember how to hold the brush? Ruth teased. I think, Claire said, rolling up her sleeves. I finally have something to say. And she did. Not about heartbreak or promises broken, but about the courage it takes to remain open. About the quiet bravery of starting again. About how love, when it's real, doesn't always have to stay to have mattered. As the first students walked in, 2 retirees, a high schooler with pink headphones, and a middle-aged woman with trembling hands, Claire met their eyes and smiled. Somewhere, between the memory of love and the shape of a new beginning, she had found herself, and this time, she was staying. The night before Claire's watercolor class officially began, she couldn't sleep. Rain tapped softly against the windows, and the house breathed with the kind of silence that only arrived after something long buried had been spoken. She got out of bed, padded downstairs barefoot, and sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, long before she touched it. There was still one thing left untouched. In the corner of her bedroom closet was a small, wooden box with a brass clasp, the one Mark had brought back from his work trip to Santa Fe, claiming he'd found it in a dusty roadside store that smelled of sage and sunburn. She hadn't opened it since the day he disappeared. For years it had been too sacred, too dangerous. It had become a metaphor, proof that she wasn't ready to see what was inside. But now, her fingers didn't tremble as she lifted the lid. Inside was a letter, unsealed. No envelope. The paper was folded in thirds, tucked beneath an old photograph of the 2 of them at a jazz night in Portland, their cheeks close, their smiles so unaware of what was coming. The letter was dated 2 days before he left. Claire unfolded it slowly, the paper soft from time but untouched by age. She began to read. Claire, I don't know how to explain this without it sounding like I'm making excuses, so I'll say this plainly. I'm afraid. Something's wrong with me. Physically, I mean. I've had tests. They called it a possibility. They want more tests. But I can't bring myself to tell you. Because I see the way you look at the future. I see it in your hands when you water the plants. In your voice when you talk about spring. And I don't want to be the one who stains all that hope. I love you. That's the truth. I loved you the second you argued with the cab driver in Florence. And again when you bought cookies for that boy at the train station who said he didn't like chocolate. I loved you when you yelled at me for leaving dishes in the sink. I loved you when you said yes to my stupid proposal, even though we both knew I wasn't ready to kneel. But I didn't know how to stay when everything inside me wanted to run. Not from you, from fear. I thought disappearing would spare you something heavier. Now I think it only shifted the weight to your shoulders. If you ever open this, I hope it's because you're healing, not hurting. I hope you've forgiven me for loving you badly. And I hope, more than anything, that you're still painting. With love that never stopped, Mark Claire sat frozen, letter trembling in her hands. The rain had stopped, but something inside her had just begun to fall. All the versions of Mark she'd held, the coward, the liar, the boy who ran, collapsed into something far more complicated. Not better. Not worse. Just human. Claire didn't cry right away. Instead, she held the letter to her chest as though her body might absorb the words more deeply that way, as though something in her skin still needed to be told the truth, softly, finally. She stared out the kitchen window, where the rain had quieted to mist and the street lamps cast watery halos onto the slick pavement. Everything looked blurred, refracted, just like her memory of that winter 5 years ago, when Mark had left. Now, she understood that he hadn't vanished out of betrayal or indifference, but out of fear, raw, unfiltered, and desperate. The kind of fear that makes good people disappear because they love too much and trust too little in their own worth. She read the letter again. Each sentence felt like it peeled back a different version of herself. The woman who had waited, the one who had raged in silence, the one who tried to forget, and the one who had held her breath each time the phone rang, half hoping it might be him, half hating herself for the hope. She found herself whispering, I would have stayed. If you had let me, I would have stayed through all of it. The clock ticked past 2 in the morning. She thought about calling Ruth, then about waking Lila, but neither felt right. This was something she needed to carry alone, for just a little while longer. It wasn't loneliness. It was reverence. A quiet sitting with of a love that had, for the first time, stopped hurting and started to become whole. She walked upstairs and placed the letter inside her sketchbook, between 2 blank pages. Then, as though guided by something she hadn't felt in years, she took out a pencil and began to draw. Not Mark this time. She drew a version of herself, eyes open, not smiling but strong, hair swept by wind, standing by the ocean alone. And not afraid. The next morning she told Lila everything. They sat on the back steps with coffee steaming in their hands, sunlight pushing through the clouds in hesitant streaks. I always thought he didn't love me enough, Claire said. But he did. Just not the way I needed. Not the way that stays. Lila reached for her hand. That still counts? Claire nodded. It does. And now I think I finally know how to say goodbye. Later that day, she went to the sea. Grayhaven's shoreline was calm, as if the town itself understood the weight of her steps. She walked past the dunes where she and Mark once chased each other, past the cafe where he'd first said maybe forever, and past the bench where she'd spent too many evenings watching waves crash while her own thoughts pounded harder. She stood at the water's edge and opened her sketchbook. One by one, she tore out the pages that carried unfinished sketches of Mark. His hands, his smile, his back as he walked away. They floated briefly in the breeze before landing on the tide and dissolving, not like erasure, but like offering. Then, from the inside pocket of her coat, she pulled out a new letter. Not written on fragile paper, but painted. Soft strokes of blue and gold forming the outline of that same figure she drew the night before. Herself, whole and open, looking outward, not back. She placed it inside a glass bottle and threw it into the sea. Not every message needs to reach someone. Some are meant to be witnessed by the water, carried by the wind, and left with the tide. And when she turned back toward the town, Claire felt something settle in her chest. Not closure, not peace exactly, but space. The kind of space where a new life might begin. As Claire walked back up from the shoreline, sand soft beneath her boots, the weight in her chest began to shift. Not disappear, grief didn't work that way, but redistribute, like a long-carried bag finally set down just enough to stretch. You're back. She wandered through the town, letting her feet decide where to go, until she found herself outside the old train station. It hadn't run passenger service in years, but the benches were still there, weathered wood and rusted iron, familiar in the way only something unchanged by time could be. She sat down and looked at the horizon. The sky was a dull pewter, the kind of color that made everything below feel more alive. Mark had once told her, on a rainy day just like this, that he believed people left pieces of themselves behind in places they loved. Not like ghosts, he'd said, but like fingerprints on glass. You don't see them until the light hits just right. And now, sitting there, Claire could almost hear the sound of him shifting beside her. Almost see his hand reaching, up to scratch the back of his neck. Almost. She let herself remember. Not the leaving, but the days before. The way he used to wake her gently by stroking her knuckles. The way he insisted on putting too much cinnamon in the oatmeal. The sound of his laugh in that ridiculous horror movie they watched and never finished. The Sunday mornings where neither of them said much but didn't need to. When love lived in gestures, not declarations. And then, the silences that followed. The hesitation in his voice. The nights he went to bed early. The way he started answering. I don't know. To questions she hadn't asked yet. She had tried to ignore it. Tried to love him louder than his fear. But now, looking back, she realized she never really knew what he was running from. Until the letter. Back home, she stood in front of the mirror, the same one she had avoided for months after he left, when she could barely meet her own reflection, without seeing loss stitched into her skin. She touched her cheek, then her collarbone, then the faint scar on her wrist from where she slipped once while cutting onions. She whispered, "You're still here. Still whole." That evening, Ruth dropped by with a pie and a knowing look. They didn't talk much. They sat on the porch swing and watched the fog roll in. Claire handed her the letter. Ruth read it quietly, then folded it and placed it back on the table between them. "We never get the whole truth, Claire, but sometimes we get just enough to heal." Claire's throat tightened. "He thought he was sparing me." "He was wrong," Ruth said gently. "But that doesn't mean he didn't love you." Claire looked down at her hands. "I spent so long being angry. I wasted years." "You didn't waste them," Ruth said. "You survived them." The stars appeared in fragments, flickering through the mist. That night, Claire opened her journal for the first time in 5 years. Not the sketchbook, but the one with words. The one she'd kept locked in a drawer since Mark left. She flipped past the blank pages, then began to write. "You left, but you didn't erase me. You were afraid, but so was I. I've carried your absence like a second skin, but now I'm letting the air touch that place. It stings, but it's clean." She didn't write to Mark. Not anymore. She wrote to the version of herself that had been waiting, faithfully, silently, for permission to let go. And somewhere between one sentence and the next, she gave it. Claire had always believed that grief would leave quietly once you'd named it. That once the letters were read, the videos deleted, and the goodbyes spoken, whether aloud or whispered into the wind, it would fade like fog on a spring morning. She was wrong. It returned not with thunder, but with soft insistence. A creaking floorboard in an empty hallway, a drawer that stuck the way it used to when he was the one tugging it open. A cup of tea made out of habit, then left untouched on the counter, because it was the flavor he liked, not her. It was a Wednesday, clouded and damp, the kind of day that blurred into all the others. Claire woke late, her limbs heavy not from sleep, but from the knowledge that there was nothing she needed to do today. No letters to open, no paintings to finish, no truths to uncover. For the first time in weeks, her calendar was blank. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like falling. She drifted through the house in a sweater too large and too soft, one she hadn't worn since the winter after Mark left. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. The fireplace was cold. The kitchen echoed. She opened the refrigerator, stared inside, then closed it again. Everything was full, and yet she felt starved, for warmth, for presence, for a voice other than her own. The ache didn't come from the absence of Mark. It came from the realization that she had survived everything and yet didn't quite know how to live beyond it. Upstairs in her bedroom, the candle had burned down to a quiet pool of wax. The clock ticked, tick, 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 and she realized she could not remember the last time she had spoken out loud to someone without the intention of being strong. She sat on the floor beside her bed. The boards were cold. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers twitching as though reaching for something long gone. And then, without planning to, she whispered, "I'm tired. Not physically, not of people, but tired in the way someone becomes after carrying too much hope for too long." Claire didn't move for a long time. The air around her felt thick, as if every breath had to wade through memory to find its way in. She let her gaze wander, up, toward the ceiling where a spider had begun to rebuild its web, across the carpet still faintly stained from a wine spill neither of them had cleaned, and finally to the empty side of the bed. That space had once meant comfort, then absence, then defiance, and now it was just space. She leaned her head against the edge of the mattress and closed her eyes. In the quiet, she remembered the day after Mark left. The stillness had felt like punishment. She had kept the curtains closed, the television off, the door locked. Not to shut out the world, but to prevent it from asking her to pretend. She'd stood in front of the mirror, willing herself not to cry, because she believed if she started, she might never stop. Instead, she had busied her hands, washed all the linens, rearranged the bookshelves, dismantled the spice rack. She had tried to remove him from every corner of her home, but grief was not something that could be boxed or laundered or labeled alphabetically. It had clung to the scent of cinnamon on the back of a drawer, to the quiet moment before sleep, when her hand still drifted to the left side of the bed, to the muscle memory of loving someone who was no longer there. That grief had dulled over time, changed shape, and now it had returned, not to wound her, but to be finally seen. She rose slowly and opened the window. The cold air slapped her cheeks, sharp and bracing. Somewhere, a dog barked. A train whistle echoed from miles away, almost drowned by wind. She let it in, all of it. Later that afternoon, she wandered into the attic, not searching, not hiding, just going. Her feet knew the way. The air was stale, familiar, Boxes lined the edges like forgotten monoliths to former lives. She pulled one toward her. It was labeled Winter. Misc inside were mismatched scarves, a broken sled bell, and near the bottom, a journal she didn't recognize. It was Mark's. Not the one she had read before. This was older, smaller. Tucked between the pages were postcards. Never sent. One from Rome, one from a bookstore in Seattle, one from a gas station in Nevada with nothing written on the back except, "You looked like you belonged there. I didn't say it then, but you did." Her fingers trembled, not because of what she found, but because she realized how much she had forgotten. Not about him, about herself. Who she was before the ache settled in like wallpaper she no longer noticed. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, then whispered, not to Mark, but to the girl she had been. "I'm sorry I left you here alone." That night, she didn't light candles. She didn't make tea. She sat in the dark with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the kitchen clock. Tick, tick, tick. And then came the thought that stopped her breath. What if this is it? What if this quiet, half-full version of life was all that remained? She wrapped her arms around herself and wept. Not for Mark, not even for the love they didn't get to keep, but for the decades ahead she wasn't sure she knew how to live without clinging to what was already gone. It wasn't drama, it wasn't collapse. It was grief in its rawest, most honest form, silent, surrendered, and human. And when the tears stopped, Claire did not feel lighter. She felt real. For the first time in years, there was no mask. No story she had to hold together. No memory she had to preserve. Just her, and the quiet, and the breath she still had the courage to take. The next morning, sunlight came late. Claire woke to the pale hush of a sky still undecided, clouds pressing low as if trying to keep the world quiet for a little longer. Her body ached, not from sleep, but from release. There was a soreness in her chest she couldn't name, a residue from the night before that clung like damp to old walls. She didn't rush to get up. For once, there was no need to perform healing, no urgency to declare herself okay. She lay still beneath the blanket, staring at the ceiling where shadows moved slowly, as if time had begun to soften its edges too. After a long while, she rose. The house felt different. Not lighter, but quieter in a way that didn't ache. She moved slowly, deliberately, like someone relearning how to exist in a space that had always demanded too much memory. She opened the kitchen cabinet, chose her favorite mug, the one with the chipped rim that Mark used to tease her about, and filled it with hot water and lemon. No tea, just warmth, just clarity. When she opened the door to the garden, the air bit at her skin. She stepped outside anyway. The ground was wet from the night's rain, and birds called to one another from the fir trees that bordered her fence. She sat on the stone bench under the fig tree and breathed in the cold. Her fingers reached into her coat pocket and found the journal, the one she had retrieved from the attic. She hadn't meant to bring it out with her, but somehow it had followed. She opened it, not to read, but to hold. Sometimes presence mattered more than meaning. And then, she whispered, not to Mark, not to herself, but to the quiet around her. "I'm still here." "And that's the bravest thing I've ever done." The wind stirred in response, soft and brief. The world did not shift. Nothing dramatic happened. But something subtle moved beneath her ribs, like breath rediscovering its place. And in that stillness, Claire finally understood. Grief doesn't end with goodbye. It ends when you stop trying to go back. It began with an envelope Claire didn't recognize. She found it late one Friday afternoon, tucked between pages of an old gardening book she was about to donate. The book had belonged to her mother, passed down with dog-eared corners and notes in the margins. none of which had ever mentioned Mark. And yet there it was. An envelope, aged at the edges, sealed, but unaddressed. Her fingers hesitated. For a moment, she wondered if it was something she had hidden herself, long ago and long forgotten. A letter never sent. A memory too heavy. But the moment she opened it, she knew. The handwriting wasn't hers, it was Mark's. Inside were 3 things: a pressed violet, dried, delicate, still faintly purple despite the years, a photograph of her standing barefoot in the kitchen, back, turned, sunlight pouring in, and a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in thirds. She read it standing by the window. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I failed to find the right moment. And maybe there never was one. Maybe we only ever get close. But you deserve the truth, even if I couldn't say it out loud. The day I left, I meant to come back. I know how that sounds, weak, irresponsible. But I believed I was doing the kindest thing by vanishing before I made things worse. I didn't trust myself to stay when my fear got louder than my love. But I never stopped carrying you. I kept the photo because it was the most beautiful moment I ever witnessed without interrupting it. You, making tea, humming under your breath, completely unaware. I wanted to ask you to turn around. I didn't. And I've regretted that ever since. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with everything I didn't know how to give you. Always, somehow, Claire sat down. Not in collapse. Not in shock, but in something quieter. A stillness that didn't come from pain, but from recognition. Because that letter, this forgotten, folded truth, didn't change what had happened. But it changed the shape of it. It made the ache less cruel, the years less wasted. It didn't undo the hurt, but it softened the story. Claire stayed on the couch long after the light began to fade. The envelope rested beside her, and the letter lay open in her lap, as if her body needed more time to fully accept what her mind had already begun to understand. That Mark had never truly disappeared. He had simply unraveled. Quietly. Privately. In a way only the deeply afraid could do, with love still clinging to their hands even as they let go. Outside, the town moved on. Somewhere, a neighbor was playing jazz, low and crackly, the kind that fluttered at the edges like old film. It was a song Claire hadn't heard in years, but she remembered its rhythm. Mark used to hum it while shaving. He never knew the words. Only the feel of it. And in that moment, something gave way. Not shattered, but softened. She stood and walked to the kitchen, turned on the light. Then, as if guided by instinct, she opened the drawer by the oven, the one filled with miscellaneous things, rubber bands, expired coupons, birthday candles. And beneath them, she found what she hadn't realized she'd been looking for. A small square cassette tape, labeled in Mark's handwriting, for a day when silence isn't enough. She didn't have a tape player anymore, but she knew Ethan at the bookstore collected old equipment and might have one. So the next morning, Claire took the tape with her, tucked carefully into the front pocket of her coat, and walked into town. The sky was the soft gray of early spring, and Grayhaven had that sleepy Saturday energy where time stretched itself, without apology. At second chapter, Ethan looked up and smiled before she even spoke. "Still collecting echoes, I see," he said, nodding at the tape. "I think this one might speak back," she replied, and he led her to the back room without another word. The tape hissed when it began to play. At first, nothing. Then, "Hi, Claire. I didn't know how to do this. You always said I was better with silence, but I think maybe I used that as a way out. I didn't say goodbye because goodbye felt like giving up, but maybe now it's what I owe you most." There was a pause. Then the sound of a breath, shaky and real. "I never stopped loving you. I just stopped knowing how to be loved by someone as steady as you. And that broke me in ways I didn't want to admit. I'm sorry for leaving, for not trusting you with the hard parts, for not being brave enough to let you see me scared. And then a sound Claire had forgotten how much she missed. Mark's laugh. Soft, tired, but still there. You used to say, "Grief is love with nowhere to go." I think that's what I became. Love, still echoing, but directionless. If this ever finds you, I hope you're still painting. I hope you're still singing in the kitchen. I hope you forgave the silence. The tape ended there. No farewell, no explanation, just a message never sent, waiting in the dark. Ethan didn't speak. He simply turned off the player and left the room, leaving Claire alone with the weight of the unsaid now finally heard. Back home, she placed the tape inside her music box, not to hide it, but to hold it. That evening, she wrote in her journal, "Some things don't get fixed, they get understood, and in understanding they become lighter to carry." She didn't rewrite their story. She didn't need to. All she did was add a final line to the version that had always been missing something. He didn't stop loving me. He just stopped knowing how to stay. And sometimes that was enough. Spring came quietly to Grayhaven. It didn't announce itself with sunbursts or wild blooms, but with smaller, more careful gestures. The crocuses pushing up through thawed soil, the mornings that no longer needed an extra layer of wool, and the return of birdsong, tentative, as if testing whether it was safe to sing again. Claire noticed all of it. She began waking earlier. Not because she had somewhere to be, but because her body no longer resisted the idea of another day. She found comfort in rituals again, watering the windowsill herbs, feeding the neighborhood cat that had adopted her porch, walking down to the harbor to watch the tide roll in and out like breath. She still thought of Mark. Not every day, but on quiet afternoons when the air smelled of rain and the house echoed too perfectly. Sometimes she heard a song on the radio or opened a drawer she rarely used and something inside her paused, but it no longer hurt the same. It was a soft ache now, the kind that reminded her she had loved deeply, the kind that let her smile at the memory instead of collapsing under it. One evening, she found herself standing in front of a canvas. She had been rearranging the studio room, the one she hadn't used in years. There were cobwebs in the corners and dust on the sills, but the light still poured in the same way it always had, angled and golden, like a kind of forgiveness. She set up her easel, laid out the brushes, opened a fresh tube of cobalt blue. The first stroke was awkward, so was the second. By the fifth, her hands remembered. She didn't paint anything dramatic, just the shoreline. The curved bench. The shadow of a woman seated, face turned away. It wasn't meant to be her, but somehow she knew it was. Lila visited more often now. She brought stories from the city, postcards from friends, jars of strange teas Claire never knew how to brew properly. They sat on the porch most Sundays, laughing over nothing, sometimes not speaking at all. One day, Lila asked, "Do you think he ever really let you go?" Claire considered that for a long time. Then she said, "Maybe not, but I think I've let go of needing him to." And that was the difference. Summer came to Grayhaven, not with heat, but with light. Slow, persistent, almost forgiving. The town brightened in color but softened in pace. Claire began to move differently too. Not faster, just more present. She no longer checked the mailbox with the quiet dread of bad news. She no longer braced herself at the sight of a flannel shirt in a shop window. The past was still with her, but it no longer defined the room she walked into. There was a day in early June when she sat by the harbor sketching a young couple. They were laughing, sharing a sandwich, oblivious to the woman across from them with a pad in her lap and a pencil moving in steady circles. Claire didn't envy them. She didn't mourn for a version of herself who used to believe love was clean and straightforward. She simply watched and drew and felt that quiet hum inside her that meant she was still alive, still seeing, still capable of turning the present into something worth remembering. Ruth joined her sometimes. They didn't talk much. Ruth would bring a thermos of coffee and sit beside her with a novel, glasses low on her nose. The two women would watch the boats bob and the gulls squabble, like churchgoers of some sacred ritual older than words. "Always thought," Ruth said once without looking up from her book, "that the worst part of losing someone was the empty space they left. But I was wrong." Claire waited. "The worst part," Ruth continued, "is when you realize the space is still full of things you never said, memories you can't share anymore, and a version of yourself that doesn't quite know who she is without them." Claire nodded. "And yet, we stay." Ruth smiled faintly. "We do." That night, Claire wrote again, not in her journal, but in a letter. This time, it wasn't for Mark. It wasn't for herself either. It was for someone who didn't exist yet. A stranger, maybe. A woman out there, sitting in her own silence, wondering if she had the right to grieve something that never fully became. "Dear you, if you're holding on to something that once felt like everything, but now lives only in the corners of your thoughts, I hope you know that's still love. And loving quietly is still brave. You don't need a witness. You don't need a name for what you had. Some stories only exist inside us, and that doesn't make them less true. Please don't wait for the pain to go before you live again. Start while it still stings. That's how you know your heart is still working. Love. Someone who learned." She folded the letter and placed it inside the notebook she now carried in her bag, along with a pen, a set of watercolors, and a Polaroid of herself and Lila, both laughing mid-sneeze on the porch last spring. One Sunday, she returned to the spot on the cliff where she had once thrown Mark's flash drive into the sea. The wind was strong, but not unkind. She stood there, not with ceremony, but with presence. She didn't cry. She didn't talk to the wind. She simply stood and breathed. The sea didn't remember, but she did. And that was enough. Months passed. Her paintings began to sell, quietly, through a corner gallery owned by an old friend of Ethan's. People bought them not because they were masterful, but because they felt like something familiar. A bench, a pair of empty shoes on a windowsill, a table set for two with only one chair pulled out. Her art spoke not of sorrow, but of having known something worth missing. One evening, as she was closing the gallery after a late shift helping a local show, she received a message. It wasn't from anyone she recognized, just a name and a line. "I saw your painting in the window. I think I've felt that silence too." Claire reread the message, then smiled. She didn't reply. Some things didn't need an answer. Some moments were complete just by being shared. As autumn returned to Grayhaven, Claire found herself walking more often. Through the park, down back alleys lined with ivy, past the bookstore, the old cafe, the quiet corners that once echoed louder with memory. Now they simply were. She wore a red scarf Ruth had knitted for her, drank tea Lila had labeled for courage. And every now and then she caught herself smiling without knowing why. One morning, as golden light broke through the east-facing window and spilled across the kitchen floor, Claire stood with a brush in one hand and an unfinished canvas before her. She looked down at the soft outlines of her sketch, then paused, dipped the brush in pale yellow, and added a doorway, open, just slightly, light pouring through. It was a small detail, but it changed everything.